I'm Mary Fitzgerald. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Open Democracy. Today I'm talking to Dawn Foster, journalist and author of Lean Out, a very carefully chosen title, a response to Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In. And I think I'll probably start by asking you to define what you understood Sheryl Sandberg to mean by leaning in, and then what leaning out is by contrast.
To me, Sheryl Sandberg's main argument was that the biggest barrier to feminism is individual women, and that rather than arguing for collective rights, workers' rights, and a kind of changing of women's position in society as a class and as a whole, what the best thing to do was to focus on individual success in your career and your family life. And I found that quite troublesome because to me, it blames individual women and women as a whole for the position that they're in, for the gender pay gap, for kind of maternity dismissals, for all of the problems we still see in like many societies around the world. I find Sheryl Sandberg quite comfortable with hierarchy, and at no point did she ever criticise any of the institutions she'd worked for or within. And instead she'd only focus on kind of mentoring as a way of helping women or individual women's kind of attitudes to work. At no point did she talk about maternity leave helping women or, for instance, kind of sharing household chores more, looking more at who cares, how they care, how they're recompensed for caring, etc. It's all very much about the individual.
There was, one of the things I thought was interesting about her book was that she did talk about sharing household duties with her husband, and about how you really need an equal partner if you're ever going to do anything ambitious in life as a woman. Of course, that's absolutely true. But you had quite a nice point in your book about how yes, you need a partner, but you also rely on cheap domestic labour of other women.
Yeah, completely.
Sheryl Sandberg definitely has a nanny or nannies, and cleaner or housekeeper and whatever else. And while it's a step forward in a sense that you can have a relationship where these responsibilities are shared, there's a whole layer of domestic work that's being done mainly by low paid women that's not talked about in these stories of individual success.
Yeah, completely. In order to work 100 hours a week and also have 2 or 3 children and your partner to do a similar job, you need people to take over the domestic duties, you need people to clean your house, you need people to drive you home at night so you can carry on replying to emails. And what I've noticed is that increasingly domestic labour is picked up by poor immigrant women who, first of all, kind of have almost no rights whatsoever, and that should be a massive feminist issue. I think migration is a huge feminist issue, especially when it comes to domestic workers, and she doesn't really acknowledge that. I think there's always an assumption that women, when they get to the top, will always act in the best interest of their gender, but nobody asks if people like Margaret Thatcher, Theresa May, wouldn't instead act in the best interest of their class. If you're elite, if you're very, very wealthy, you feel a lot closer to very, very elite, very wealthy people, not necessarily a migrant domestic worker who shares your gender.
In some ways, certainly Margaret Thatcher was a product of a system that was so, she had to be more male, quote unquote, than any of her peers or contemporaries. And so in a way, to me, she illustrates the point of what happens when you don't have many women in power. You have somebody who almost feels like they have to prove themselves more and be tougher and harder than men are. That's I think if you really did have gender parity in these positions of power, couldn't you envisage things being different? Or do you think that the class and the context and the sort of other unconscious prejudices
I think it depends. I think if you had a mass movement where a lot of our institutions reach gender parity very, very quickly, then that would force a culture change. But what I see instead is a media and a climate that tells us that every single time a woman gets a senior job, that's to be applauded because it's trickle down feminism. Once you get one woman, then that will automatically benefit people lower down the chain, etc. When I actually don't see that happening. Like if you look at Norway, they have quotas for boards, and it's changed almost nothing, because the women who've been appointed to those boards are very, very similar in culture and outlook to the men who are on those boards. You know, a lot of them know each other from the same kind of elite clubs, etc. So the women who've been appointed to those boards haven't really rocked the boat, so nothing's really changed. Instead, we've got a right-wing government in Norway who instead are kind of rolling back women's rights quite slowly, and the same happens in Sweden. But Sweden's quite interesting because the way they've actually changed recruitment in the public sector means that it's almost 50-50 men and women. And at the same time, the private sector, which is right next to a public sector that's reached gender parity, hasn't changed at all. So even though the public sector is now more representative, that culture change hasn't kind of drifted over to the private sector because they haven't been forced into it.
This leads me quite nicely into what. So if we've defined leaning in. What is leaning out?
So for me, leaning out is refusing to participate in the systems that perpetuate oppression. So it's going on strike, it's withdrawing your labour, withdrawing care, etc. So I mean,
that's quite hard though for people people from underprivileged backgrounds. I mean, how what can someone go away from this and say, I see this is unjust, what can I do?
The people I've spoken to who are doing it, so for instance, a lot of housing campaigners, so the Focus E15 Mums, for instance, they have, for years now they've had a stall in the centre of town where they speak to people about their housing issues, they tell people about their housing issues, and they get more and more people talking about it and going to Newham Council and saying, we won't put up with your housing policy actively harms people. If they try and evict young mothers, then they ask the community to come out and either resist eviction or occupy the town hall. I've also met a number of women who have to do a huge amount of unpaid care, and more and care as it's removed from the council. So what they've done instead is I met two women who basically wrote down every single thing they had to do, and then worked out how much it would cost the council if they actually funded it, and pointed out to them how much they were saving over and over again, and argued that social care had to be a feminist issue, but also one of the things that the council was funding. So if you ask people what they want kind of taxation to pay for, people will say social care, but it's such an invisible issue sometimes people don't see it being taken away.
I was struck by something as well in your book about how feminism had moved from the goal of improving all women's lives, the idea of sisterhood, and it's replaced by this idea that you can improve your life. If you're a feminist, you can improve your life. You can be a feminist and wear high heels, be a feminist and enjoy sex, or whatever else. And that's the sort of shift that's really happened. Is you can be a feminist. Like nowadays, you can be a feminist and be very focused on your own. It can be a mantra for self-improvement.
It's more like it's this strange idea that feminism is a lifestyle rather than a political movement. So it's like. So, there's a chapter in the book called Can You Be a Feminist and? Because I kept seeing these strange articles pop up over and over again. And it became a joke with my friends where we'd type that phrase and then something else. So I think once I typed, can you be a feminist and drink milk, and found 5 articles discussing whether or not drinking milk was a feminist act. Apparently it's not. Cows are female, you're exploiting their labour. But, and it's all like, can you be a feminist and shave your legs? It's like, well, you can be anything and pretty much do anything except work against the interests of women as a group. But that kind of ties with kind of Sandberg's argument that feminism is very inward looking, but it also kind of absorbs the kind of patriarchal idea that you should always be critiquing yourself, etc., rather than the institutions that stop you from earning as much as you might like or spending enough time with your children, etc. And this strange lifestyle feminism is quite toxic, I think, and it's also used as a way to kind of sell goods to us. So I always thought Dove was quite a naff soap that smelt a bit odd, but now it's apparently a feminist product, because we've got to the point where like feminism is gaining ground, but also kind of diluted a little bit by brands and used as a way to sell things back to women.
I noticed that you often responded to some of Sandberg's points in the book with stats from the UK, where she uses stats from the US. And I was wondering if that's deliberate, if you're saying actually there's no difference. There are material differences in parental leave and things here in the UK. We have protections here in the UK and Europe that American women don't have, and I think that makes quite a big difference. But are you saying that essentially, okay, the UK system is a bit less harsh, but we're talking about the same phenomenon here?
Yeah, I think it's very very similar phenomenon, but also I think we're moving more towards the American model. I know that a lot of American companies are moving over here, etc., and we're losing a lot of the kind of hard-won rights we had before. So women now who want to take an employer to court for unfair dismissal, being sacked during pregnancy, or for a pay dispute, now have to pay a tribunal fee, which is out of the reach of many, many women. So we're losing a lot of those rights, whereas at the same time we have a lot of companies who are bringing in kind of American-style perks. But one thing they have in America now, which is becoming more common, which is quite terrifying, is especially like Silicon Valley companies offering women egg freezing as a perk, which is, I find completely terrifying. A, because it's massively intrusive, like both personally but also kind of biologically. It's a really hard process. But it's also a way of saying to somebody, you know, just don't get pregnant, just work for as long as possible, because your life and your pregnancy is an inconvenience to our company.
And there are also lies about how successful that procedure is.
It's not effective. It's a really grueling procedure. It's very painful. It's quite dangerous, and then you end up with a fewer than 2% chance of getting pregnant at the end of it anyway. There's often a perception that feminism is like is a bit like an onwards march, whereas I feel like it's more like a staircase, and you can go up as well as down. And I think quite often we forget that rights can be rescinded as well as given. So the fact that we now have to pay tribunal fees, the fact that more women than ever are being laid off during pregnancy, the fact that the gender pay gap is widening again, is quite worrying. And I think sometimes people forget that, and just so if you focus on kind of public attitudes to sex, etc., like whether or not you can shave your legs and be a feminist, and then just assume that your legal rights are protected, then we can end up in a really terrible position, as we increasingly are. And again, a lot of that comes down to who sets the agenda in feminism. If it's kind of upper middle class women who have relatively okay jobs, and their main problem is kind of cultural attitudes towards women, does that mean that we forget about the women who are precariously employed, the women who have care responsibilities, the disabled women who struggle to work, etc.? The
women who are cleaning the houses and looking after the children of the middle class women who are doing those jobs.